Chapter 4. Be Well Learned. Learning of one's own accord. Wilhelm Heine. The children are taught with strict discipline. Both boys and girls enter primary school. There they are taught reading, writing, and the history of their fatherland. Wilhelm Heine, artist, visited Japan from Germany in 1853. Recognized for his skill in painting, he traveled around the world as a sketch artist. Wilhelm was born into a family of artists. His father was an actor of the court theater, and his family also had connections to the composer Richard Wagner. After majoring in architecture at school, he went to study abroad in Paris to specialize in painting. In the midst of his studies, the French Revolution of 1848 occurred, which ended up greatly affecting the fate of Wilhelm afterward. In the following year, his hometown of Dresden was swept up in the current of the revolution, and Wilhelm, who had returned by this time, also participated. Faced by suppression from the army, Wilhelm decided to flee to the United States. In the same year, he fled to Paris first, and then arrived in New York in 1849. During his first days in the United States, Wilhelm was unable to find a permanent job and lived a life of hardship. However, his artistic skill was recognized by archaeologist Ephraim George Squire, and Wilhelm was able to secure a job producing illustrations for Squire's archaeological research. He accompanied Squire, who was also a diplomat, to his various assignments abroad, and illustrated the scenery and culture at every destination he visited. At the time, the topic du jour in the United States was of Commodore Matthew Perry going on an expedition to Japan. Wilhelm's interest was greatly piqued, and he petitioned directly to President Millard Fillmore to participate in the expedition to Japan. This was a time before cameras were prevalent, and a sketch artist was essential for capturing the scenery of expedition sites. Wilhelm's hopes were thus realized. Took notice of the Terracotta style of education, which fostered high academic skill with independent learning. Wilhelm entered the town of Edo and observed various things. The teaching style of the Terracotta temple schools left an especially strong impression. At the time, mandatory schooling did not exist. Education at the Terracotta was entirely one-on-one, and instruction was carried out according to each individual student's rate of progress, with emphasis on independent learning. According to one theory, the literacy rate in the 19th century was said to be 30% in London and 10% in Paris. In contrast, the literacy rate in Edo around 1850 was said to be around 80%. A comprehensive human education was a distinct characteristic of the Terracotta of Japan. Children not only learned reading, writing, and arithmetic at the Terracotta. Through interacting with others who gathered there, it is also said that they learned manners and behavioral patterns befitting to one who would serve a lord in the future. In the Taiho Code, established in 701, there was supposedly already a law related to education called the School Ordinance, Gakuryo. One can infer that Terracotta was a form of that tradition that was passed down. Children of all ages gathered at Terracotta, from toddlers to middle school age. Wilhelm saw these children of various ages working studiously at their respective levels and was engrossed. He sat down on the spot, observed meticulously, and sketched with fervor. Wilhelm returned to Dresden at age 45 when the German Empire was established. From then on, he worked on writing a book summarizing his experiences in Japan called Japan, a study on its land and inhabitants. And until his dying moment, he continued in his efforts to introduce Japan to the world. Education for building character, Henry Dyer. The Japanese samurai, and to a very considerable extent all the other classes in the country, were fairly well educated. But it was not for the purpose of enabling them to pass examinations or to make money, but to build up character. Henry Dyer, engineer-educator, visited Japan from Britain in 1873. Recognized for his scholarly and technical talent, he arrived in Japan by strange coincidence. Henry began working at a foundry as an apprentice at the age of 15. He worked during the day, and at night he studied at Anderson's College. Henry's ability was highly recognized by the factory manager. He was complimented as being diligent, focused, and cautious. True to those words, Henry was a voracious learner, and he attended night school for 5 years while working. At this school, there was also a certain Japanese person who would create the opportunity for Henry to go to Japan later on. His name was Yamao Yotsuo. Along with others, including Ito Hirobumi, had smuggled themselves into Britain to gain knowledge and experience for the modernization and industrialization of Japan. They were attending night classes at Anderson's College while studying shipbuilding on site. After the Meiji Restoration, Yamao, who was planning to found the Imperial College of Engineering, was looking to appoint a professor for the university. He turned to a trading company that had previously helped him, Matheson and Company of London, and asked for a referral. President Matheson received his request and forwarded it to the University of Glasgow, which was at the center of the British Industrial Revolution at the time. Professor Rankine, often called the father of modern engineering, then recommended his favorite pupil, Henry Dyer. By this time, Henry had graduated from Anderson's College, earned top grades at the University of Glasgow, and won numerous awards. Finally, he had been chosen out of many for this opportunity. Through this turn of events, Henry arrived in Japan fresh out of university at the young age of 25. He would go on to work as the first principal of the Imperial College of Engineering for 9 years. Once Yamao found out that Henry had been attending night classes at Anderson's College during the same period as him, they got along famously, having shared the same experiences in school. Yamao supported Henry's work wholeheartedly and ended up supporting Henry's activities greatly behind the scenes. Noted the ethical perspectives of the Japanese people and contributed to the modernization of education in Japan. Young Henry, with lofty aspirations, constantly strove to provide a holistic education, placing emphasis not only on acquiring knowledge, but also on training the body and mind. As an instructor, he focused on and highly praised 2 things about Japan. In his opinion, Japan's secret to its rapid growth of capitalism, as well as the source of its increase in national power, lay in these 2 things. One was the fact that the citizens actually carried out the morals stipulated in the Charter Oath, which was the fundamental policy of the Meiji government. The other was the existence of primary and intermediate level educational programs, which produced high educational standards. Henry also stated that the Japanese ethics of the Bushido, the warrior's way, served as a backbone that supported Japan's rapid absorption of Western technology. He wrote of the Japanese, "When therefore Western learning and science were introduced, they found a field well cultivated for their reception, and characters prepared to take full advantage of them." From his words at the beginning of this section, one can see how impressed he was at the stance of the Japanese toward modern education. During this time in Japan, the feudal system crumbled, and a centralized administrative power was reorganized. Henry lived through this time of great reform in Tokyo. He witnessed firsthand the process of the rural regions being absorbed by the central power, such as through the abolition of the feudal domains and establishment of prefectures, as well as land tax reforms. He was awed at how smoothly and how quickly national unity was established. Although his field of expertise was in technology, Henry also strongly emphasized the need to preserve Japanese traditional culture. Do not flaunt your education. Philipp Franz von Seibold. Orderly, polite, and dignified, heartfelt kindness, sincerity, and modest education that shows not a hint of pride were all present in stout elderly lords as well as in children and women. In other words, all of these traits are worthy of respect by educated Europeans. Philipp Franz von Seibold, physician, nobleman, naturalist, visited Japan from Germany in 1823. Had a strong interest in nature from childhood, and eventually became a widely recognized top academic. While in school, Philipp stayed at the house of Professor Dollinger, a friend of his deceased father. It is said that he obtained a considerable knowledge of the natural sciences from the scholars that visited the house. He was a student of medicine, but always had an avid interest in nature and eagerly absorbed new knowledge. In 1822, he was posted to an army hospital of the Dutch East Indies, where his deep knowledge of and inquisitiveness toward the natural sciences was recognized. He was ordered by the Governor-General to travel to Japan, a trading partner of the Netherlands, to do research. Philipp was 27 at the time. Philipp was not only renowned as a physician, but was a highly praised man of knowledge. He was first-rate in everything, from biology to ethnology, botany, and geography. It is said that even before his arrival, rumors abounded amongst Japanese academics that an incredibly well-learned physician was coming. Philipp's duties were to care for the personnel at the Dutch trading office in Japan, as well as advancing his investigation and research of Japan. When he accompanied the tribute mission to Edo, he used the journey to immerse himself in studying the nature of Japan. He observed the geography, various plants, climate, and even astronomy. From the sheer volume of his records and the enormous scale of his collection, some speculate that he may have only had 3 hours of sleep per night. In his second year of work, Philipp bought a house in Narutaki, in the outskirts of Nagasaki, so that he could give lectures on medicine to Japanese physicians. This became the famous Narutaki Juku, or Narutaki School. Here Philipp taught Western medicine, or in other words, Rangaku, Dutch studies or Western sciences, taught in Dutch. Philipp not only treated Dutch trade office personnel, but also saw Japanese patients of his own volition. His aptitude soon became widely known outside of Dejima as well, and it is said that a large number of passionate young Japanese medical students flocked to him from various places after hearing stories about him. Through interacting with commoners of Japan, came to an acute realization of their high level of culture. Here, Philipp built close relationships with his students and the townspeople. He was constantly impressed at how Japanese academics, despite having a high level of education and culture, never boasted about it. Even the commoners, who were not academically learned like the scholars, were, nonetheless, recognizably cultured in their behavior, having traits such as kindness and humility. Philippe expressed wonderment and surprise at this observation. Philippe lived his life in 1820s Japan to the fullest at his house in Nagasaki. His activities were wide-ranging and colorful. He built friendships with academics in Edo and also obtained maps of Eizo and Karafuto, which were rare at the time. After returning to his home country, Philippe published his great work, Nippon. As the forefather of Japanology, he actively worked to disseminate his knowledge and experiences of Japan in Europe. Philippe left many notable works, such as Flora Japonica and Fauna Japonica. These works became significant stepping stones by which Europe, and later the rest of the world, came to be aware of Japan. Keep up with the news, Paul Bonnetet. Firstly, I will say that in no other country are there as many novels read as there are in Japan. One can say this about novels as well as newspapers. This is because in Japan, the news plays a very important role in daily life. Paul Bonnetet, Marine officer, travel journal scholar, visited Japan from France at the end of the 19th century. Sounded a warning that the cultural beauty of Japan would be lost due to westernization. Paul traveled in an expedition to East Asia as a member of the Marine Infantry. He compiled and published the records of his experiences, which were widely read in his home country, and he rapidly rose to popularity as an author. In his works, Paul criticized Japan for modernizing under pressure from Europe and the United States, and strongly asserted that Japan should return to its traditional roots. This was the extent to which he loved Japan's traditional way of life, perhaps even more than Japanese people. How many dreams have been stirred up from this one word, Japan? As soon as this word is said aloud, artists will raise their heads, and even the women, who are said to be the most reclusive of readers in France, will often pine to travel to the country of fantastical, gentle lacquerware. Thus begins the introduction of Meiji Japan 1886, the portion of his massive work, The Far East, which deals with Japan. Paul saw the good of Japan in things like the elegant and attractive women who wore kimono and smiled amiably, the beautiful Japanese gardens and their blossoms, and the beautiful coastline of Nagasaki Bay. He expressed anguish at the loss of these things due to imperial orders, writing, "I wonder if the Japanese imitation of the customs of us Western people will lead them to poverty they are not yet aware of." Astonished at the high readership of newspapers, but forecasted the challenges of Western-style democratization. In another section of the same book, titled History of Japan, Paul lays out the origins of the Japanese race, as well as their physical and mental characteristics, and attempts to explain their cultural characteristics as well. One such trait is what is given at the beginning of this section. The Bakumatsu era was a tumultuous period in Japan, and people likely checked the newspaper and other news outlets frequently to have a grasp of the state of society. However, despite this high level of social knowledge, the rulers recklessly conducted a governmental and societal reform modeled after the West, as Paul criticized. This reform risked destruction to Japanese traditional culture. Perhaps one cause was because the government was still politically undeveloped and had not yet reached readiness for democratization. Paul wrote the following about the democratization of Japan. What is certain is that, by becoming democratized to the same extent as becoming civilized, Japan will undergo the same trials of our democracy. He also wrote, if these reforms, considered a great pride, bring a love of equality, but at the same time, if new compromises to demands from the masses in the rural region wishing to act like Europeans bring many benefits of democracy, but also along with it bring an increase to the cost of living and an increase in taxes, these same citizens will probably become nostalgic about the past. Along with this political perspective, Paul also closely observed Japan's cultural characteristics. His repeated warnings about the westernization of Japan is still well worth heeding to those of us living in the present day.